Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am here with great pleasure to introduce one of Wellesley's own, Claudia Dumas, today. She received her AB in Economics from Wellesley College and her JD from the Cornell Law School, after which her career has spanned the private sector in both law firms and corporations, government services, and nonprofit capacities. She is now the president and CEO of Transparency International USA, where she leads the development of legal, regulatory, and corporate standards and approaches to reduce and deter corruption. Her experience with developed, emerging, and developing markets allows her to develop effective solutions to complex problems, all the while assessing how those solutions will be viewed by governmental and non-governmental stakeholders. With work within Fortune 50 companies, global law firms, the U.S. government, leading professional associations, and elite non-governmental organizations, Ms. Dumas has demonstrated leadership in a broad range of management responsibilities, working in rapidly changing circumstances and addressing multidisciplinary issues, coalition building, strategic positioning, and sensitive discussions with government officials. Prior to joining TIUSA, Ms. Dumas served as the first executive director of the World Justice Project, where she led a global multidisciplinary effort to strengthen the rule of law globally through joint actions by stakeholders in over 15 fields, including business, education, finance, government, law, and public health. She also led the development of a new worldwide rule of law index. Ms. Dumas also spent 7 years as the Senior Rule of Law Advisor for the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. Her experiences span 25 years of public, private, non-for-profit experience in anti-corruption, rule of law, and international finance law, and so clearly cannot be summarized by me in this short period. So please just welcome me now in welcoming Ms. Dumas.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that generous introduction. And the next time I'm looking for a new job, I'll call on you, and we're all set. Well, good morning, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts and having a conversation about one of the areas where I have spent a lot of my time, which is thinking about the effects, but not just the effects, but how to deal with and combat those caused by the phenomena that we call corruption. So with that in mind, I thought I'm going to talk for a few slides and then open up for some conversation, if we can take it that way. I have room for questions at the end. I have a little bit of a brain teaser hypothetical built into the middle of this that has no absolute answers, and I thought we could also use that as a vector for some conversation. Anyway, corruption. We all hear about it, I'm sure, as you're working on your various projects, that there's been references to it now and again. But it is clearly a scourge that we are dealing with, that we face in developed and developing countries. It cuts through efforts to basically do almost anything. Importantly, it reduces the wealth available to nations. It diverts the flow of resources that would otherwise go to specific projects. It undermines, perhaps most importantly, individuals' trust in government. So it can alienate communities from taking actions on their own behalf. It breeds instability, and it also can impact most of all, the most vulnerable in societies. From a business perspective, it raises uncertainty. It increases the cost of doing business. It has the potential to inhibit foreign direct investment, which is something that many countries are seeking as part of their economic growth model in providing for those within their borders. In other words, this is a bad thing. How does one define corruption? What is it? There are several definitions that float around. I am here in my capacity as the president of Transparency International USA. So I am using the definition that TI has adopted, which is the abuse of entrusted office for private gain. The key word on that is entrusted. We do not say at TI, though there's another formulation that you see that the World Bank often uses, the abuse of public office for private gain. So when one says entrusted office, one is picking up actions by those in private sector capacities, such as the heads of business organizations to whom shareholders may have entrusted and given certain fiduciary responsibilities. Corruption is not just bribery. Bribery is probably the most commonly thought of manifestation that we use to see corruption. And it's one that I'm going to probably slip into talking about corruption by reference to bribery at various points in time. Some of the legal standards we see look at corrupt practices in terms of corruption, but it can also be nepotism. It can be bid rigging. It can be kickbacks. It can be collusion. There are a number of ways besides bribery that corruption can show its face. How big is the problem? Now, there are not official statistics on corruption. We don't have a log where somebody says, okay, if you took a bribe today and you demanded a bribe, please go and report it so we can measure it. Indeed, corruption thrives in opacity, in the shadows, in where we can't see it. But there have been a number of estimates to measure the impact of corruption. I like the one that comes from Danny Kaufman, who is a former chief economist at the World Bank and head of the World Bank Institute. He's an Argentinian economist by training. And he has estimated that the cost of corruption annually could be $1 trillion US. He's put a margin of error on that of about $600 million. So whether you want to kick that, 600 billion, so whether you want to kick that up or kick that down, we're talking $1 trillion a year. The money is, that we might look at for developing countries as well as transition countries, transition usually referring to countries that are coming out of communism and going into a market-based system, is going to have a number of 20 to 40% of the flows of official development assistance get affected by corruption. If we were to drill it down to a smaller example, there's been an estimate that hooking up a single household to the cost to clean water supply is increased 30% by the cost of corruption. There are a variety of data sets and statistics and ways of measuring corruption and looking at it. If you haven't discovered the World Bank Institute data sets on governance, I would commend them to you. They look at 6 different measures of good governance, one of which is control of corruption. What's neat about this data set is that it is updated periodically. You can also get your own schematic charts, looking at changes over time, looking at changes by population, looking at comparing countries by region, looking how a country might compare on rule of law versus corruption versus voice and accountability. But just to kind of start digging us into what we're talking about and how it shows up in countries, I thought I would put this chart up from the World Bank Institute. This is an aggregation index. It picks up, looks at a variety of other data sources that the World Bank Institute has used in measuring corruption. We're talking about the control here of public sector corruption we're talking about. So we're talking about government officials. We're not talking about beyond that. But when we are looking at it 0 to 100, 100 is where one wants to be. That is the nirvana. And it just gives a sense of where countries might fall at various points in time. This data is from 2012. Transparency International has what we call, and many of you may be familiar with it, the Corruption Perceptions Index. And at the end of the class, I have a laminated copy that I want to make sure that all of you leave with for a copy of that. TI uses the CPI to rank countries of the degree to which corruption is perceived to exist among public officials and corruption. So this is a public sector measurement. It is a perception index. We carry it out both among residents of a country as well as pulling on experts. And we pull together a variety of other data sources. And this comes out annually. It comes out in December of each year. And this year we ranked 177 countries The countries are ranked on a score of from 0 to 100. 0 is at the bottom. 100 is the perception of being clean or very clean for the public officials. And when one takes a look at this map and at the gradations, we have basically a sea of red. Indeed, 2/3 of the countries that were measured this year scored at 50 or below. Which countries? Just to do a quick snapshot. These are the top, I wanted to give you the top ranked countries, the top 10. As you can see, corruption is something that affects both developed and developing countries. The US, where I think most of us would say things work pretty well, actually is down at 19. I cannot give you the specific reasons why. This is an index. We don't have the exact causality. From a TI perception and my own work, I would speculate that some of the reasons in the United States may be perceptions about the effects of money in politics in our political system. There have been a number of scandals at the state and local levels over the last several years about government officials. Important to think when you think about this index, it does not necessarily limit itself to national level governments when it's measuring a problem. There may also be some spillover effect. Everybody on Wall Street is corrupt. Look at Bernie Madoff. So there could be some information that's a little bit outside the official parameters of the index. Countries at the bottom tend to be those that have had some very prolonged periods of instability and are working particularly hard in terms of how to organize themselves, how to pull themselves forward. These are the very difficult cases where corruption is very much entrenched in everyday practice. There are a number, and this has been, I think, a positive development. There are a number of legal conventions, but also standards that have been populating over the last decade and 2 decades dealing with corruption. And I'm not going to go through every one of them on the list, but I wanted you to have a sense of the magnitude and the number of initiatives that people are using to try to tackle corruption and aspects of it. I can tell you that I need to actually sit down as an expert in the field when I see these and think, which is this one trying to measure? How does it relate to something else? It is indeed an explosion of conventions that we're dealing with. The first major convention, first major law was the U.S. Law for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It was adopted in 1977. This was a law that made it illegal for officials of a company, U.S. companies as well as other countries who trade on the U.S. markets, to offer or to pay a bribe to a foreign official in exchange for obtaining or retaining business. So business in international, bribery in international business transactions. That particular statute has become the foundation for what we call, the second one listed, the OECD Convention Against Business International Transactions, which has now been signed by 40 countries around the world. There is the UN Convention Against Corruption, which is the one that I've third listed. You've just seen the chart that says 2/3 of the world's countries below 50. The UN Convention Against Corruption has been ratified and has 170 state parties. So there's still a ways to go in getting to the implementation of the many provisions of that convention. But in addition to conventions, there are initiatives, there are standards. The G20 group of nations has an anti-corruption working group. The business community has joined as well. There's now something we call the B20 that parallels the G20. And the Business 20 now provides annual recommendations and suggestions to the G20 for combating corruption. There are sectoral initiatives. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an initiative that encourages, it's adopted by a country, says they're going to participate. It asks industry to report the payments that they are making to government officials for mining and natural resources payments. Those payments are then published, so civil society can see the payments that are being made. Trade is another big area. There are anti-corruption provisions in trade agreements. As many of you know, there's a new trade agreement now under discussion called the Transatlantic Trade Agreement. That will be another one to take a look at. Lots and lots of activity, lot of talk about corruption. All of these will have different actors. All of these will try to get at corruption from different angles, in many cases at very specific issues. I wanted to say a few words about Transparency International, because that's the place that I currently am hanging my hat. TI is what we call a global coalition fighting corruption. We have more than 100 chapters worldwide. Each chapter is its own organization. TI USA is a 501c3 charitable organization. We have our own board of directors. Each TI chapter will make a decision, and we do have some ways that we have a common threshold throughout our movement, but we'll make a decision on what are the most important issues for it to focus on in its own country. Chapters work both individually, but we also work collaboratively. So as an example, TI is putting forth recommendations to the G20 countries for what key reforms should they be promoting, what changes at the annual meetings of the G20. TI USA works on that with 19 other TI chapters. We identify what we believe are the most important ones. We will then at TI USA go have discussions with the US government to understand where its priorities are, attempt to persuade where we think focus should be, and obtain information about that. So we work both individually. We also work collaboratively, so we can be more than the sum of our parts. We have an international secretariat based in Berlin. When you hear Transparency International, that may be the movement. It may also be our international secretariat in Berlin. The secretariat is where most of the index work is actually led and produced for TI. We have pretty good coverage around the world. There have been some challenges, as with many nonprofits, in sustainability. So we have some thinner presence right now in Africa. There is an accreditation process to become a TI chapter. There are a number of standards that are applied to make sure that the TI chapters ideally are truly dedicated to focusing on combating corruption, and not a chapter that will be set up just as a political arm, if you will, of a government to try to promote an appearance of progress where it may not actually exist, or to limit the dialogue around the issues of corruption. TI's approach is unique in that we are focusing on systemic change as one of our goals. But we are also working with all parts of the equation in terms of trying to get to change. So we will use our expertise and work with governments, work with the private sector, and work with other civil society organizations. Corruption is such a complex problem, and there's so many actors when we talk about the behaviors and the incentives to continue corrupt practices, that we're only going to see change if there is a collective focus, a collaborative focus on ways to deal with corruption. I think it's important, and some of you may be aware of this, to realize that there is many incentives for many people to keep engaging in corruption as there are to change. We're not talking just at the top of a political government where there may be a great deal of money that a minister can make by taking a privatization scheme and can be funneling the money into his pockets by finding ways to structure the privatization, pay off his cronies, get an expensive trip for his wife to do some shopping. But it also occurs at the very lowest levels. People who are being asked to pay a bribe to a doctor who will be maybe a state official to ensure that his or her family members get medical care in a hospital. Paying tickets to the traffic police so you don't get a ticket for something that you really weren't accused of doing. Interestingly enough, the smaller stuff, what we call petty corruption sometimes, or administrative corruption, is actually often very organized, and there is a system of sharing the payments up and across government ministries and government bureaucracies. So it may also be very difficult for the individual policeman to say, no, I'm not going to take that bribe, or not going to solicit that bribe and demand that bribe, because there may be an expectation for money to flow upward for he or she to keep a job. TI is generally, we are seeing changes in some chapters. We are generally non-investigative. So we do not investigate specific cases of corruption, but we will call out patterns and problems loud and clear where we see it in various countries. As a civil society organization, Transparency International is especially focused on the role of civil society in combating corruption. And as you can soon start to think, this means that freedom of expression, freedom of association is particularly important for civil society to play its role. But we believe that civil society has a key role to play in advocating and creating public pressure for reform, in monitoring governments to ensure that the reforms are actually enforced and sustained over time, and to contribute to the development of actions, tools, and best practices. We have a number of tools. The Transparency International website is full of reports, full of indices, full of documents, full of press releases. But some of the primary things that we do are we do have several surveys that we conduct on an annual basis. It includes the Corruption Perceptions Index, which I've alluded to. There's also something called the Bribe Payers Index. How likely are business people from various countries to offer bribes as part of doing business? So it's actually a flip of the payment equation. It's not on the acceptance and the demanding, but of the offering. So we're trying to get at both the demand and the supply side of corruption. We do, at the individual country level, many of our chapters do national integrity studies, looking at challenges and opportunities for strengthening integrity in a country. These are very complex, usually 2 or 3 year exercises to come up with recommendations. The OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which is the one that prohibits the bribery in international business transactions and makes it illegal, is one that we monitor enforcement of that by the countries that are parties to the OECD Convention every year. There are 40 countries that are now parties to the OECD Convention. Colombia and Russia are the most recent countries who have deposited their instruments of ratification. Enforcement is something that still lags on this convention. So we have an annual report monitoring how is enforcement actually taking place at the country level. The convention requires each country, it's not self-executing, to make the trans-border corruption illegal in that country, and then to take steps to implement and enforce the law. We have a global corruption report. This comes out annually. It is on thematic topics. We had a report on corruption in education. There's been another one on corruption in climate change that was done fairly recently. So that last one is a topically driven series of essays, if you will, looking at a corruption from the point of view of various country chapters. In addition to the measurements, we issue a number of tools working with the business community. We have something called the Business Principles for Countering Bribery, which is a guide to help enterprises, be they large, be they small. We actually have a small and medium-sized enterprise version of the tools to figure out what are the best practices for putting an anti-corruption program and a good ethics program in place in their companies to deter bribery by their various corporate employees. We have some sectoral initiatives that are in place, and interestingly enough, for the last several years, there's been an uptake in something called advice and legal advocacy and legal advice centers. These are similar to legal aid clinics, where people can go to seek advice in particular cases. We're seeing them in developing countries as well as in developed countries. TI Ireland happens to be at present one of the most active Transparency International chapters with what we call ALACs. TI, we've been thinking about where are we now? Transparency International was formed 20 years ago. What progress have we seen? What are the challenges ahead? Like many organizations, we do a strategic planning process. As many of you may know, corruption is not a word and not a concept that the World Bank historically talked about. Only in the late 1990s, when President James Wolfensohn at the time gave a speech where he mentioned the cancer of corruption, was the first time that the World Bank talked about corruption and development and about corruption and challenges within the World Bank. So what we're seeing higher attention given to corruption. We're seeing that there are not only many legal frameworks and initiatives, but they're becoming more stringent. We're seeing increased cooperation and efforts across border to deal with corruption. Globalization on this last point has both created great opportunities but also great challenges. It is very easy for kleptocrats to use the global financial system, to take the monies that they've harvested and to be able to transfer them across boundaries. But we're seeing justice departments in a variety of countries working together on cases of corruption and investigations and on prosecutions. Challenges ahead. Keeping corruption on top of the agenda, combined with the need for implementation and enforcement, remains a key issue. Of the G20 countries, 4 are still not parties to the OECD Convention Against Corruption. Laws on the books are usually actually pretty fine. If you look at the laws on the books, many countries have great laws against corruption. The problem is enforcement as well as implementation of those laws. If one looked at the OECD Convention and said, okay, we have 40 countries who are parties to this convention prohibiting bribery of foreign government officials. There are 40 countries. In our last annual survey, only 4 countries would we classify as having active enforcement. And those cover 27% of the world's exports. There are 20 who have little or no enforcement, covering another roughly 26% of the world's economy. Growing concern about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, for what are their efforts to combat corruption, what are they doing, particularly as they are playing an increasingly larger role in the global economy. Ensuring implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption is a significant challenge. The UNCAC does have a country review mechanism. The transparency of that at the country level is something that UNCAC has made some pressure on, but we are still working to get to greater transparency in the review process. The UN Convention covers a whole spectrum of corruption and transparency issues. Some of the provisions are binding, some of them are aspirational. Countries should attempt to do the following. There's a great deal of work to be done if countries are going to actually step up and really focus on, in a meaningful way, implementing the provisions of the UN Convention. It is, with 170 countries, really the only convention that covers the globe with a single international standard. The TI USA is based in Washington, D.C. We are a relatively small NGO. However, we also are very ambitious and have very high standards in the work that we are trying to achieve. We are focused on combating corruption both in the United States and internationally. We also recently went through a strategic planning exercise, and we came up with 4 priorities for the work that we are doing. Some of these complement the work that we're doing with other TI chapters. The first one, not surprisingly, greater implementation and enforcement of global anti-corruption laws and standards. There is an example of one of the issues that came up recently under this bullet. There was some discussion several years ago in the U.S. Congress about changing the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The FCPA really is in many ways the leading example It was the forefather of the OECD convention, and we had concerns that if the FCPA was weakened, other countries would look for opportunities to drop their legislation back if there was a weakening. So we had a number of discussions of what could one do to avoid having the FCPA changed by legislation. What we advocated for was that rather than just go in and do legislative amendments, that the DOJ and the SEC, who have responsibility for enforcing that act, should take a look at some of their enforcement challenges and see if there might be some opportunities for greater guidance for the application of the law, so it wouldn't need to be amended. There were certain members of Congress who felt that the law might be inhibiting economic growth in their home states. There were debates whether U.S. businesses were less competitive because of the FCPA. And we said rather than just amend the law and risk a cascade and a race to the bottom, let's see about guidance. A year and a half ago, guidance was released. There's a 150-page plus document jointly issued by both bodies. TIUSA was actually consulted on some of the provisions of that guidance, and that is now reflected in the resource guide. We are focused at TIUSA on the private sector and help working with the private sector on increased integrity and anti-corruption. The U.S. international business community is, needless to say, a fairly significant presence around the world. We are doing a study right now with some practical research and consultations to produce a guide for U.S. enterprises engaged in international business on how do they verify that their anti-corruption programs are actually working as intended. So it's not just what are the elements that you need to have, how do you do your training programs, but how do you verify that they're working? This involves using a variety of risk-based approaches. Is it better to work with lawyers? Do you work with accounting firms? What does a certificate mean? There's an organization called Ethisphere that will issue certificates, and they have a list of the 100 most ethical companies in the United States. So we're trying to explore and be able to publicize what all of these attributes mean with a goal of getting to more effective programs. We also have a roundtable that we convene quarterly with the leading compliance officers from 30 companies that are all in, believe the Fortune 100, where they are informally talking about best practices and what their experience is and discussing among themselves some of the challenges and some of the solutions that they're finding in doing their corporate programs. In the United States, greater transparency and accountability remains something that we believe requires attention. United States down at 19. We have picked several areas to focus on. There are several pieces of legislation for greater transparency about how the U.S. government spends its money. There's something called the Data Act that would provide some additional information at U.S. spending in a more granular detail, which we are advocating for passage of that. We are trying to get complicated area, I'll spend a little more time on it shortly, greater transparency around who actually owns companies. Often, if you form a company in this country, you can find out the first level of who owns it might be another company, but not who are the individuals behind the company. This area we call beneficial ownership is a key area for reform right now on the global stage, and it's one the G20 is focusing on. Because U.S. incorporations happen at the state level, there are a variety of views by the U.S. states as to whether the U.S. Congress should pass legislation requiring them to capture additional information about companies when they're formed. Prevention of corruption in international development, twofold focus. We've had a long history of engagement with the World Bank, including on the World Bank's practices that it uses for its sanctions system for when there are cases of corruption found within the World Bank. We have also developed, and we are working on it, further testing it both internationally as well as in the United States, a tool for civil society to be able to monitor government procurements for red flags of corruption. This is making me think that I did miss one item that I wanted to call out for you, knowing you have an infrastructure focus on your assignments for TI tools, which is that TI has pioneered something called an Integrity Pact. We started them in the 90s. The Integrity Pact is an agreement, it applies to government procurements. It's an agreement between the procuring governmental body as well as the bidders to abstain from requests for bribery, accept offering of bribes, collusion, or other improper behavior. There is also usually a monitoring mechanism built into these, so civil society will be involved in monitoring the procurement to ensure that that pact or pledge is upheld. These can be very complex, but it is, and the negotiations and establishing a integrity pact will vary from procurement to procurement, from sector to sector. So I've been doing a lot of talking here, and I want to kind of stop doing all of that talking. So I'd like to introduce you to Inertiana, which is a country that is pulled from a number of countries around the world. It is a 5-year-old constitution, provides for independent judiciary, protects civil and political liberties. It has a new government that was elected 2 years ago. The Minister of Energy is seeking bidders on a production sharing agreement for firms to come in and to explore and develop oil fields in the country. There's a national law on integrity, and it says public servants cannot accept or solicit bribes. Inertiana's government has put in place what they call an independent anti-corruption commission to investigate government corruption. The judiciary, we have judges selected under merit-based systems. And you're working for a firm that submitted the lowest bid. Great news. However, life gets a little more complicated in Inertiana. And I would love to hear some suggestions of what you would do in the first scenario, which is even though your firm put in place the lowest bid, the most competitive bid by price, the minister wants to sign an agreement with a company whose bid was a little bit higher than yours. And word on the street, because often there's a lot of information out about corruption, is that the president of that bidder is actually related to the Minister of Energy's cousin, who happens to own a very nice villa overseas, may have a couple of nice luxury cars as well, that he acquired after the privatization of a telecom sector. So here's your firm, had the best bid. Somebody else is about to sign it, number 3. Any thoughts about what you might do?
Hi, thanks so much for being here. So I guess the first thing that I would think, besides the personal relationship between the president of the company and the Minister of Energy, I'd want to go look at the proposal. Maybe it's better. Like, what did we, like, that would be the first step that I would do to make sure that it's not just that it's better and that we forgot something with our low bid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's good. So let's assume that you can get access to the proposal. And let's assume that actually yours is even better on the quality of it. It's a great first instance. Any other thoughts? And I'll throw out a little bit of information. 2 more hands on this side.
Thank you for being here. I would check out the company itself. Maybe it has a really good reputation, and maybe it has more experience than the company that we're currently working for.
Okay.
I would look at the legal code of that country and see if what they're doing is actually, if they're doing what you think they're doing, whether it's illegal, and whether there might be, if the corruption stops at the Minister of Energy, which I doubt it would, if there might be legal recourse.
Okay. Anything else? Over on the left. 3rd row up. Can we keep the mic moving? If not, I can even run it.
In addition to looking at what the official legal resources are, I would probably ask around to see how effective those would actually be in practice if I did decide to undergo like some sort of legal action, and to see how well that has actually been enforced in that country.
Okay. All great suggestions, all good insights. In many cases, in many countries, there is not even a law that requires public competitive procurements. So question number one, is there even what does the legal framework require? There may not even be a requirement for public competition. In which case, very nice, but there may not even be a requirement. It may not exist for a particular sector. And there are several countries in the energy arena who still have not passed laws, although they're doing privatizations and development that govern the work in that particular sector, that have the requirements for how that's going to work. So the legal framework may not be in place. The relationship to the Minister of Energy's cousin, it suggests that there's probably a fair amount of corruption that's in place. You may not be able to prove anything, and that's one of the challenges. That the money is overseas, but you don't know how do you actually find that money. Who controls the company that, in this case, puts the bid in? There may not be a public registry that's open to the public. The public registry may not have information that you can see. On and on, transparency, and I see a question I'd love to get it to in the next row to the back, is something that we're desperately still working on.
So what I was thinking thank you for your presentation and for coming. What I was thinking in my head the whole time is if I were in this person's position, I would try to ask TI for help, but I didn't know what you guys in this case, what if I asked you for help in this instance, what kind of do you provide advice to companies, and how would that process work?
If there's an ALAC, it might be able to help you. In many cases, one may be able to get some information as well if you're from a country that is fortunate enough to have the resources to have an embassy presence. In many cases, there's also a commercial presence associated with the embassy. There may be an international chamber of commerce that you may get some information from as well. So those are additional reasons. The reality is that you have a process that's moving forward pretty quickly, and it may be challenging to do this. I would also note, and I don't know if anybody saw the article that was, and I'm going to slightly off point here, in the New York Times about 2 days ago, called A Light Bulb for Nonprofits. It's not just the commercial sector that deals with issues such as this, but it's also nonprofits. There was an article about a neat company run by an American engineer. She's a nonprofit. She came up with an approach for a very cost-effective way of providing light therapy to help infants with jaundice. The approach that she developed was supposed to be made sense from a cost point of view. It could be distributed, could be resourced, was going to be acceptable to many countries. The sales price that they were looking at was about $500. She found out that the suppliers the distributors in Indonesia were charging $2,400 for the product that she had priced at $500. The answer was, we need to build in room for kickbacks. So just an observation, it's not just global business, it's not just huge infrastructure that starts running into challenges in dealing with the economies around the globe. Okay, scenario number 2. Okay, you want the contract. We're going to keep going. You can have the contract, but it's really hard to bring in stuff, says the minister, at the border. And I have a customs official who can really help you get this stuff through. And I want you a broker, and I want you to hire this customs broker who's going to help in getting all the exploration and development material that you need across the border so you can do the development work that's in your contract. If you hire him, you have the deal. What would you do? Yes, next to the back row, in the middle. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I've been working at GE in compliance for the past 2 summers, so a lot of what you're saying is very familiar to me. And at least from that perspective, what I've learned from doing that, they have a big emphasis on knowing your customer and knowing who it is that you're doing business with, and like performing due diligence to make sure that that is like a legitimate transaction that's going on. And so I would, I guess, suggest that this customs broker have some type of background checks and make sure that they're like a legitimate person who can handle this and not, I guess, in this case, be somebody who could be like an inside person and might do something with this money that they're getting.
Okay. Anybody else? You're right. Investigation and diligence on suppliers, on third parties is critically important. In this case, probably your best thing to do is going to be to say no, because chances are, if I'm looking at this scenario, if I'm being told I have to hire somebody, there's probably a kickback that's going to take place. That this customs broker is going to be throwing some money back at the minister, and I've just probably engaged effectively in a payment for obtaining business. I'm sorry, second row, all the way over, yeah.
Thank you for being here. If you're not actually paying the bribe, is it illegal?
If you are not actually paying the bribe, yes, it can be illegal. Let's move down to number 3. And that's a good question. This is where this area starts getting very complicated in terms of trying to come up with solutions on an international stage. You got the contract. You didn't have to hire the customs broker. You said no, you held your ground, and you commence work. But because you're doing construction, you have subcontractors doing work for you. And you've learned that the foreman of Divert and Pocket has been purchasing pipe for the pipeline that you're working on at a rate 20% above market from somebody in the Department of Public Safety. What might you do? It starts to look as if maybe there might be some bribery going on to a government official to keep some business in place. It's not your company. Is it a problem? You need to do something? Right-hand side all the way over, please.
Thank you for being here. It is a problem because you're associated with them. So if the news broke out to the media or if the public started kind of asking questions, your name is in the mix. And it's like guilty by association.
Okay. And by the way, everybody can say thank you for being here. You're welcome. In front. We need to bring one all the way down.
If the pipe is still of good quality, though, and the company has obviously its own company, so doesn't it have the right to choose who it decides to buy from? And if on top of that, the Department of Public Safety is getting revenue and is able to use those funds for other good uses, then is that still necessarily a bad thing?
Okay, good point about is the pipe of good quality. Often we see cases when we have these things of pipe that is of goods and services that are actually lower quality in the production. Actually, as a legal matter under most of the international conventions, and including under the U.S. FCPA, a company or an organization doing business internationally can be held responsible for the actions of third parties that it does business with. It can't just, so customs brokers, suppliers, distributors. There's been a number of cases, just to pull out an example of one sector in the news that show up about pharmaceutical companies and what's happening with third parties who are helping sell their product to hospitals abroad, which in many cases are government-owned and state-owned enterprises, so you have payments to that party. So not only is there a requirement in practice of diligence, but you may actually be responsible for having to think about, do you need to flow down requirements about how your suppliers and third parties and foremen will operate. But now you know about it, what do you do?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This doesn't necessarily answer the question that you just posed.
That's fine.
But this is a really excellent example to think about the challenges and the complexities of the issues of corruption. However, from your presentation so far, it seems like Transparency International is very much focused on enforcement of law. And what it seems to me is that
these are symptoms of a broken system. And so how do you change a system that promotes and allows corruption without doing more than just enforcement of pre-existing law or implementation of legal system?
Okay. Well, number one is calling for increased transparency. It's a great question. Getting increased transparency at all levels of government, if one can get it. So budgeting, expenditure of funds, engagement, secondly, of citizenry and of actors in a country, because this is something that is a behavioral issue. As a call out, number one, don't pay the bribe. Say no. How can we organize? We have a focus now on trying to figure out how to engage youth. Is a particular area. So we're talking, we have a whole campaign on stepping up against corruption. Collaborative action. Thirdly, I would say that working with businesses, with governments, finding opportunities. There's not a full, immediate solution, but there are also success stories that we are seeing. Also important to think that we're talking about incentives for bad behavior. This is one of the things where I get frustrated with conversations about, well, there's no political will. There may be a minister or sub-minister 3 levels down from the very top who wants to put certain reforms in place that he or she believes are very important, may even benefit that person professionally. There may be some opportunities to build some transparency and accountability in that particular pocket that you can explode out. And finally, and I may think of other things in response to a very good question, competition is part of the answer. It's not just a legal question on the enforcement. It is behavioral, but it's also getting more competition in to help break the hold of those who are engaging in corrupt practices, be that on the business side, be that on the political and government side. All right. I don't even know where to begin. Let's go right next to you, the woman in red, please.
As a sort of follow-up question, we've been discussing a lot of incentives in our talks, and I'm just wondering, for countries that sort of the incentive is actually to turn your head on corruption, for example, in Italy, Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has been like the main corrupt political official for the past 3 decades, and he has been offering his own personal, his personal capital to the country, and that's really, I mean, that's a great incentive. As a young Italian youth, ironically enough, some of the people that I have spoken to, they see him as sort of this really cool guy who gets with women, who has a lot of money, and who controls Italy. So how do you sort of counter that incentive by enforcing and by promoting this civic activism in a country that it's just not there?
Well, you may recall that at the beginning I said one of the dangers of corruption is that disillusionment and is that absence of engagement. And so I think you're giving a great example of that consequence. Part of it is asking those members of a society, those youth who do care about where the country is going, to start band together and starting to do something about it. You can't force people to do it. But if you're trying to look for greater jobs, greater employment, greater opportunities, it is saying it's time to wake up and do something. And that's actually the name of the new TI campaign, is called It's Time to Wake Up. Because so many things get tinged by corruption. What issues do people really care about? Health, education, where can you look for that? There are review mechanisms, as I've indicated, if I jump up to the higher level under many of these conventions. May be able to find some process on the review mechanism. Not easy. Look for opportunities for success at a small level and build on those. In the middle, I can't see name tags right now. Pink shirt, black sweater.
Hi, as a follow-up to your answer for Ace's question
Yes.
about how do you combat corruption, you talked about greater transparency on various government levels, more collaboration. What are some actual, just actionable things that we can do on a community level, on a government level that can create this transparency or increase this kind of collaboration that you're talking about?
Okay. Number one, you have to do your homework to know where the transparency areas are missing. I happen to think that procurement and the awarding of contracts is a huge area. It may not sound like the sexiest area. This is how schools get built. This is how hospitals get built. Are there standards that allow for access of information and require competition for how public works are being done, for building those hospitals, for getting those schools, for making sure that the teachers perform? There are tools available. We have one on monitoring procurements where civil society can actually sit down and follow a set of procurements. And we have a yes-no automated system looking at was there transparency, were things done? This is looking for red flags of corruption in the planning of the project, in the bid evaluation in the bidding process, in the bid evaluation and the implementation. You can aggregate data. Some of you aggregating data is huge. I'm sure many of you have heard of something called IPayToBribe.com in India. Is that a familiar story that people are familiar with? IPayToBribe.com, it's had a variety of success rates in other countries, and there's a variety of theories on those which were cultural, which were government co-opting. But IPayToBribe.com is a platform that lets Indians, it's had great success in Bangalore in the motor vehicles department, report if they've been asked for a bribe for specific government ministries, whether it's for getting a passport, whether it is for getting a driver's license, what were you asked for and how much did you have to pay? And suddenly the data starts getting aggregated from all of these individual cases. It makes it harder for a government bureaucracy to say, I'm sorry, there's no corruption here. In Bangalore, which has been cited as one of the success stories, the Department of Motor Vehicles for driver's license now has an automated test for people doing the driver's license with electronic sensors, taking out the human factor, having seen this, and also applications for driving licenses are now done online. All the way on the left-hand side, silver necklace.
In response, I guess kind of building off of all of the questions that have been asked so far, I was just wondering about how to promote transparency with issues of guilt and shame. So I think that a lot of people don't want to, or a lot of people in public positions that have been entrusted with certain responsibilities don't want to admit that they've done something wrong, or don't want to be found out that they've been in a bind where it has caused them to do something that is morally questionable. So, and in our last presentation with Professor Burns, he was talking about how, in all of the countries around the world, trafficking is a global issue, terrorism is a global issue,
right.
And at the same time that we're all guilty of these things, no one really wants to admit to participating in something that is dark or that would be disapproved of. So how do you begin this conversation and having greater transparency and vulnerability when everyone is too scared to admit that they are culpable in some sense? How do you promote an environment of openness without causing people to necessarily fear being punished or stigmatized by other people?
It's a great question. Naming and shaming actually can have positive impacts. It can also have negative impacts. And I can tell you that Transparency International gets questions all the time. There's a prominent Central and Eastern European government right now. How do we change our score on the TI index, on the CPI? Because we're not understood. The answer is you can't just change your score. You change your score by doing things that make a difference to people when they answer the polls. But there are opportunities sometimes for collaboration with quieter discussions. And not everything that TI does in advocacy is public. Some of it is very public and very visible and very loud. Others are quieter conversations, saying, let's talk about some significant changes and why it's in your interest to make those changes. So I think civil society has a variety of tactics available at its disposal. Second to blonde hair, glasses. I'm sorry I'm not doing names here. Then we'll bring some of the questions up front if I'm accidentally hitting the back one.
Hi. So throughout the presentation, we talked largely about the private sector and businesses and governments, but I wanted to know if you could speak towards corruption in the nonprofit sector, because I know there's a lot of examples where nonprofits are on the ground level carrying out work, and they have the food supply to give relief to refugees, but in order for them to do so, they have to provide maybe some sort of bribery or other type of form of corruption, and that ends up reinforcing the regime. So where do you draw the line with moral, I guess, I know it's very complicated.
Rationalization.
Yeah, I guess, especially with nonprofits where they're often perceived as being solely acting in good, which I'm not saying or dismissing that, but I think maybe how could we pressure more regulations on the nonprofit sector?
You're absolutely right. The nonprofit sector is not always clean and pure, nor is it always perceived as that. I can recall when I was doing work focusing on the formerly communist countries of the former Soviet Union, some of the NGOs were basically the neighborhood beautification club, and they were getting funds, things that were not generally well done. Other cases go to, we need to make payments to ensure the distribution, we need to make payments to keep our people safe. The answer is those rationalizations can divert the flow of resources that need to be in other places. Some NGOs can lose their charitable status by not having clean books and records. And this I start to sound like a legal framework question. But I can tell you as an NGO, I have to report on how we use our resources. We have annual audits, and my filings go to the Internal Revenue Service. The frameworks for NGOs to operate and organize in many developing countries are still very, very challenging. There are some great organizations that are giving assistance on how the frameworks look. But there are many opportunities for an NGO who's also trying to do the right thing to get caught up in tax inspections and tax police. Can they sell materials not at a profit to be able to conduct their business, or are they subject to sales taxes? So the nonprofit sector, absolutely a problem. There are cases where people use it for personal advantage. There are cases where there are payments that are made on a rationalized basis. And it's an area that continues to need attention. Blue sweater, black shirt, second row.
You mentioned that companies are being held responsible for the actions of third parties that are involved, but can you talk a little bit more about how they're held responsible, especially when detection is so hard? So for example, in scenario 2, if I assume that the deal wouldn't be detected and I take the deal, how would I be held responsible for my actions?
Well, the question becomes, there may well be a complaint filed with, if you know about it, chances are someone's going to report it if you're an American company, if you're a British company, but if you're a French company, to your enforcement authorities. And there's a whole area of when does a company self-report? First, do you conduct your own investigation? When do you self-report? Might you get caught up in having to worry about whether you're liable both under the laws of Inertiana as well as your home country for what has taken place? There are some practices, we're seeing them in the United States, where companies are given what we call deferred prosecution agreements or non-prosecution agreements if they have brought a case forward and if they also have the evidence that they had done everything that was required in terms of vetting and training. So there may be ways of bringing down what the liability would otherwise be. Right here.
Thank
Yes.
you. My name is Barrett, and my question is about, yesterday we talked about briefly the environmental policy of instead of providing plastic bags for people at stores, they can either, some policies are to bring a certain amount of money to pay for a plastic bag at the store, or they could receive money for bringing one, for not using the plastic bags that are provided. So I'm wondering, is there a difference between charging people when corruption is found versus versus giving them some sort of monetary incentive, for example, a tax break when they're found to be clean. So looking at everyone and saying everyone who's clean is going to get this money as a reward. It's like a tax reward or something. I'm wondering if there's any kind of that kind of policy that you've done.
It's a great way of thinking about positive incentives. I haven't seen that used. I would worry about people trying to figure out how to game the system on that one. Let's see who I haven't called on.
Hi, my name is Anna. So, in my understanding, the corruption, or especially petty corruption, is really connected with the economic situation of the country. So, for example, in Georgia, the country, for the longest time, no, it usually gets mixed up. So, anyway, so for the longest time, doctors or policemen would take bribes because they hadn't received their salaries in months. You know. So how do you deal with that, or what do you think about that?
Well, what President Saakashvili did in Georgia, as you may recall, was he actually created for the police, he did a new police force. And he put new arrangements in place in terms of compensation, in terms of providing them with their own cars to use, because in many cases, civic officials actually have to provide their own cars. They may need to provide their own gas for their cars. And I think he put in place a very low zero tolerance policy as well. So that was a systemic institutional overhaul. But you're right, the delays in payment are a problem. There's also been a debate about how much money is enough in terms of increasing compensation. Also in the case of Georgia, which is a country that I actually probably spent more time than is healthy in at various points in time, and I know fairly well. The judiciary went through a process where there was a new series of competitive exams. The judges were trained, there were new ethics standards, they also were given new higher salaries. However, the results of seeing positive changes in the judiciary were lagging. And there were a variety of issues that I think we called out there. One was just how do you change established patterns of behavior? One is what's enough money? But also what's going on with other parts of the system. So where was there pressure, formally or informally, working with prosecutor's office, working with expectations of how certain cases would be handled? How was the court staff performing? How much was mistake versus actual corruption? Judiciary is doing much better now. But the answer is you do need to, resources are important, as you're calling out. Leadership, in a perfect world, you have leadership at the top of a country to make for changes. President Saakashvili's tenure also had in the later years some criticism of certain of the approaches that he did as well. These are complex dynamics, but Georgia's a great example, I think, in many ways of a success story. Who hasn't had a chance to ask a question, if I can do that? Is there anybody who I haven't called on?
So I'm curious in terms of the perception index, how much of the perception is actually legitimate? So is there ever a case where a country would have sort of a low perceived, so highly corrupt score, where in actuality the public sector may not be as corrupt? And how might that influence people wanting to work with that public sector? Have you found that, or is the perceived corruption index, does that tend to pretty well align?
First of all, there is actually quite a bit of research that suggests that when you have a large enough data pool, perceptions of corruption often correlate pretty closely with actual levels. The other thing the TI does, it uses a number of different data sources in doing its particular surveys. So if one is skewed, and we actually don't even use all the same data sources for different countries, the same as the World Bank will be. It will pick more reputable ones. You're going to limit the effect of that goes on that. But there's a whole host of information around data and index construction, but it's a great question. One more. Right here.
Oh, I have one. Okay. Thank you for speaking with us today. So I feel one of the most important factors in reducing corruption would be public accountability, where the public stops thinking of corruption just cynically as a way of life and starts demanding more transparency. For example, in India with the upcoming elections, there's a movement with the Aam Aadmi Party or the Common People's Party where there's a lot of enthusiasm and support for reducing corruption in India. And to me, I mean, I'm not too familiar with it, so it kind of seems like it came out of nowhere, but it's a good thing at the same time. So I'm wondering how you can mobilize the public to care more about transparency.
A number of our chapters are actually doing ad campaigns to try to get at people that way. I think giving examples of success stories is always important. One of the things I've learned in my work in development and that I've heard often is you need to give people a place to go to. It can't just be what you need to go away from. So give an example of where there have been success stories. And they're out there. You can find them, and I think that's going to help as well.